All my favorite thrillers sort of deal with something universal, I think. So I was looking for uh, what would be a sort of great universal theme that would sort of travel. And I've always been fascinated by sleep, but I came across it was actually originally a podcast, which I came across about people who do really interesting things when they sleepwalk, and stories of people who get up in the middle of the night and go out for long drives, and then come back home, get back into bed, and in the morning have no memory of any of it at all. And the idea of people's eyes being open, but their brains still being asleep. So they look as if they're totally functional, but actually they're completely asleep. Their brains aren't sort of the rational part of themselves isn't working. So that intrigued me, and then I came to research the real life cases of people who committed murder when they sleepwalk. The fact that some people have been the idea of the sleepwalk defense. So some people have been, not being believed and been found guilty of murder. Other people have actually been let off. So that intrigued me that the law couldn't quite decide whether these people were guilty or innocent. And then when I came across the other real life sleep thing of resignation syndrome, which is a real life thing where people fall into a deep sleep for years on end. And it's a sort of one of the great mystery illnesses in the world. No one quite knows what causes it or what it's all about. So when I put those two things together, someone who commits murder while sleepwalking then falls into a deep sleep. That was the sort of eureka moment, really. That was when it all came together. And that's when the story was born. It started with once I had that sort of eureka moment and that research idea, it was then who was going to sort of embody that. And I think characters are, if you don't like the characters, then in some ways it doesn't matter what happens to them. So the character of Anna came to me sort of very early on. I made her a writer because that's what I knew. And someone who was into sort of true crime, someone who had a sort of investigative journalism background, and the most unlikely possible murderer, basically, is what I was trying to come up with. I mean, and so the case of Anna O is that she stabbed her two best friends to death. And then she's found asleep at the crime scene and no one can wake her up. And 4 years later, the forensic psychologist called Dr. Prince has to try and wake her up so she can stand trial for the double murders. So that Anna Benedict relationship, that was the sort of central axis of the book, the central dynamic, and is that sort of relationship I spent the most time on in terms of developing the characters. Throughout the book are Anna's notebooks, the diary entries really that she writes leading up to the murder. So you get all the backstory there, who she is, what she's about, and you're sort of contrasting that with the Anna O, who is the sort of global true crime phenomenon in the front story. So I was interested in that sort of true crime way where people get taken out of their context and become sort of monsters or larger than life. And so that we're introduced to the Anna O case in the present day, where you know her as the sort of notorious double murderer, and then you go back to the notebooks and you see the real person trying to figure out what on earth could have caused her to do this. And that contrast between the sort of public image and the private self, that was really fun to write and interesting to write. Dr. Benedict, he works at a place called the Abbey Sleep Clinic in Harley Street. That's based on a real life sleep clinic. And yeah, the forensic psychologist who specializes in sleep, that was absolutely based on a couple of real people who do that. And there's also another neurologist called Suzanne O'Sullivan, who's the main person globally who's sort of researched resignation syndrome. So I'd say all of them contributed to the character. And I was so keen because all my favorite thrillers are sort of based on reality. I find reality is even stranger than fiction. So every single bit of the book in terms of the methods Dr. Prince uses in terms of the illness, all of that is absolutely true. So it's I've already heard from loads of readers that it sends them on sort of rabbit holes, Googling late into the night as they realize all these things are true. So and so that was a real priority for me when writing it. I wanted to um, make sure with such a sort of high concept book, it was always going to be about, how it lands. And so yeah, I had the ending. The twist was the first thing that I sort of had down on paper, and sort of then work backwards from that in terms of making sure everything added up, and all the sort of threads, were drawn together. So I always had the twist in mind. Yeah, the world is convinced that she's guilty mainly because of a WhatsApp message she sent just before she was sort of found, which suggests that she knew what she was doing and was intentional. So that's where the world doesn't really believe the sleepwalking story. But Dr. Prince, because he's sort of drawn in, he spends a lot of time alone with her. He's got well, basically the the cure for resignation syndrome is restoring hope to someone's life. That is, so resignation syndrome is basically when you've given up. And the only way you can get patients to wake up again is when you give them a reason to live. And so the only way Dr. Prince can do that is by finding out more about Anna as a person and what her goals are and her aims. And by doing that, he becomes much more sympathetic to her. He sort of realizes that the Anna O true crime phenomenon is not at all Anna the real person, and so he moves from sort of skeptic to believer, I think, and yeah, and then becomes by the end of it her one of her sort of champions.